Ladies and gentlemen, fight fans all around the world, let's talk some boxing. So I'm going to try and spend a short time talking about uh, the longest undefeated streaks in boxing history. Okay? The longest undefeated streaks in boxing history. But before I even get into that, I know a lot of you guys are going to say, oh, that's easy. Floyd Mayweather, 49-0-0. Rocky Marciano, those are the longest winning streaks in history, and that is not true. But I want to make mention of something. A lot of people think it's really easy, at least at this level, championship level, for a fighter to retire from boxing with a record like Rocky Marciano's. Think about it this way. If there were such ease for someone to be able to do that, then a lot of boxers would have done it since 1955. When Rocky Marciano finished boxing. Alright? No, that record stayed since 1955 for a reason. Now, there's some boxers who came close to doing it. Larry Holmes was one of them. But he went and referred to Rocky Marciano. Shouldn't have done that. He opened his big mouth and said that. So he was beaten by Michael Spinks. A fight in which, more than likely, he definitely won. Floyd Mayweather didn't do such, and he's 49-0 at this present point in time, like Rocky Marciano. Now, let me just show you how difficult that is. I don't know if you guys remember Cesar Rene Cuenca. Remember that dude? Remember that there was much talk about him matching that after Floyd had just beaten Andre Berto. You remember Cesar Rene Cuenca? He was 48-0. Now, I'm not saying that Cesar Rene Cuenca, he was, this great fighter and had fought great fighters through his 48-0. But what's very interesting is that Cuenca, if you look at his record, he meets up with a guy called Edward Troyanovsky, who was the #1 contender for his title, the IBF World Super Lightweight title. And Edward Troyanovsky causes him to quit the first time. When he rematches him, he gets beaten again. Alright? And my point is very simple, really. My point is this. He was able to beat a number of opponents, but when it came to facing a particular opponent, he wasn't ready to fight and beat that opponent. Okay? At the championship level. Now imagine this. I'm just putting some things in perspective here. Rocky Marciano, he became world champion and he fought 7 championship fights. 7. See, he was world champion in his 43rd fight, and he finished in his 49th fight. There was 7 fights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, they are noteworthy fights, don't get me wrong, except for these two, Don Cockell and Roland Lastarza. But the point is, he only had 7 championship fights. Now, take a look at this. Cesar Rene Cuenca, he only had 1 championship fight, right? He beat Zhu Shiming, I think is his name, or Ik Yang, or something like that. I can't remember which one it is. It was a Chinese guy who was, undefeated, and they thought he was going to beat him. And then he comes around and loses, before he could even defend successfully, he loses his championship belt. So what it tells you is to get 48-0 to start off, or 49-0, whatever. To get this sort of record here, there's a reason why fighters since 1955 haven't done it at the highest level. I'm sure some professional fighter in some bars hit 50-0 fighting barroom brawlers. I get it. Yes, of course. Low-level competition, anything can happen. You can be an undefeated fighter against low-level competition. Absolutely. But when it comes to world-class, high-level competition and competition that's worthy for you to face, that's very, very difficult to do. That's my first point. My second point is that when you look at Rocky Marciano and you look at Floyd Mayweather Jr., you have to understand that when we talk about undefeated fighters or undefeated winning streaks, there are other fighters who have had larger undefeated winning streaks, but not as perfect as Rocky Marciano or Floyd Mayweather. But there are other fighters which have had longer undefeated winning streaks. And some examples of them are Ricardo Lopez. This is not the Ricardo Lopez I'm looking for, though. So I'm for some reason or the other, I got this Ricardo Lopez, who I don't know who he is particularly, but this is not the Ricardo Lopez I'm looking for. So let me see if I can just find him for a minute. He's supposed to be known as Finito. So it's not Ricky, it's not Explosivo, it's not Mendoza, it's not Tieniente, it's not El Titi, it's not Ricardo, and it's not Ricky. It's Finito, right? This is the guy I should be looking at. So anyway, he has a record much bigger than Floyd or Rocky Marciano. He has an undefeated record of 52 fights. Okay. Julio Cesar Chavez, the thing about Julio Cesar Chavez is for the first 90 fights of his career, he was undefeated. He had one draw. That was against Pernell Whitaker. That's right here. So 90 fights in, you'll see there's not a single loss. It would be in red. Alright? For his entire career. Well, not his entire career, up to the point where he lost to Frankie Randall. Willie Pep, in the beginning of his career, he actually didn't even have a draw or in his career. Beginning of his career, he went 62 fights before his first loss against Sammy Angat, which is remarkable. And then after losing to Sammy Angat, he went 74 fights with one draw, and before he suffered his first loss against Sandy Sandler in his 137th fight. Okay. Then you got guys like Sugar Ray Robinson, who had an 89 fight undefeated streak. It wasn't a winning streak, but it was an undefeated streak. He had a couple no contests in there and some draws. But that was after he had lost to Jake LaMotta after 40 fights. So in his 41st fight, he lost to Jake LaMotta, and then it wasn't until 89 fights later, 90 fights later, that he actually had another loss, and that was to Randy Turpin. But he's not the only guy. We had Packy McFarlane. Now, Packy McFarlane, he had 113 fights. And Packy McFarlane, with only, I think, 75 are acknowledged. After his loss to Dusty Miller in his 9th fight, he went on to win 104 fights, ending undefeated in his career. Packy McFarlane. You got Carlos Monzon. Carlos Monzon, after losing 3 fights, he would never lose again. He'd go undefeated for 80 fights in his career and retire undefeated and world champion. You got Jimmy Wild. Jimmy Wild went for 104 fights without losing. He had some draws. He was undefeated in no contest, but for the most part, he was an undefeated fighter for 104 fights before he faced Tansy Lee for the flyweight championship of the world, and he lost to him. We have Jimmy Barry as well. Jimmy Barry, he went undefeated for 72 fights in his career. He had a couple of draws, some no contests, but for the most part, he was undefeated. Now, while that is the case, like I said, it has to do with level of competition, and that's what makes these things so difficult. With Jimmy Barry, he did fight some notable opponents later on in his career, but for the most part, if you look at his career here, and just look at this column here, pay attention to this column, these are all the opponents he's facing. You can see that most of them, I mean, after your 10th fight, you know, we expect you to be facing something other than a debutante. Let's just put it that way. Look what's going on here. He's got fights. He's got a lot more experience than any fighter. And this is happening not just in his first, say, 10 or 20 fights. No, my friend. This is going all the way up to his 46th fight. He's still fighting debutantes. All in his 55th and 58th and 58th fight, he's fighting debutantes, you know. So a great chunk of his career, he's just fighting mostly debutantes or very inexperienced fighters. And his first experienced fighter comes up in his 59th fight. He's fighting a guy with 12 fights. Then he fights Jack Ward, which is a good fight. That was actually a more experienced fight. This is almost to the end of his career. Remember, he had 72 fights, so he has 12 more fights coming up. And this is where he's actually fighting guys with some kind of fights behind him. So Jack Ward is one. Most of these guys are just so inexperienced. Billy Rochford is another. Casper Leon, who we would face 2 more times. Steve Flanagan was a good fighter. And that's basically it. So this guy, when you look at Jimmy Barry, most of his fights in his career were against debutantes or very, very inexperienced fighters. But that's the signs of that time, because this guy only fought for, I think it is 8 years. I think he finished his career in 1899. Yeah, 8 years. So this guy, he was a flyweight first of all. So maybe there wasn't a whole bunch of flyweights. And then the other thing about the system back then, it's not like the system today. The systems today, we have levels in boxing. So you have a debutante level, then you have, prospect level. You have early prospect level, which is a guy, he's a prospect after 10 fights. And then you have contender level, and that happens when you deal with some sort of gatekeeper. And a gatekeeper is generally a journeyman of some kind. You have different levels of journeyman. You have the bum journeyman, which is like a guy who just lost all his fights to begin with. You got a higher level journeyman, which can help like a prospect move along. He's got some wins, he's got some losses, sometimes equal wins, equal losses. And then you've got the high caliber journeyman, where he has more wins than losses, and he can test the fighters to see if they're ready to become a contender. And the high level journeyman, they're the ones that really are the gatekeepers. They're really that good. They're so good that they almost are like a contender, but they've lost every single time. Or they're former world champions even, who've kind of lost their spunk, so they're a name that the contender can fight against, and that can give them a way to fight the champion. And then you have world champion, and then you have 2 sets of kinds of boxers. You have mediocre, you have elite boxers. You have good boxers, and then you have elite boxers. A good boxer may become a world champion, but an elite boxer, he's elite throughout his career. His record shows that the level of competition he faces is stiffer than, say, a good boxer, so that when he gets to the championship level, he's tested, and he can be tested to the ultimate max because he's an elite fighter. So there's different levels in the sport of boxing. But back then in 1891 to 1899, it's just anybody used to fight anybody. The guy could come off the street and fight you, right? That's why you see so many debutantes, because all these different people were fighting him, but he had more experience than all of them. At least they didn't have a recorded, formal resume. Let's put it that way. So that's what's happening here. That was the old school where anybody just fought anybody. And now we get to see that as a result of that, because you didn't have levels in boxing, then you didn't necessarily face opponents which were, shall I say, on your level of boxing. And while they were more unknowns, and there was always this crazy unknown in it, because of your skill sets and everything, you're always at advantage to them. So that's what happened with Jimmy Barry. Okay? Now, if we put this into perspective so you'll understand what I'm saying, out of those 72 fights that Jimmy Barry fought, he had 1 legitimate win. 1 legitimate win. And that was against this fighter right here. His name is Jack Ward. Jack Ward had more than 20 fights. So he was a legitimate fighter. In fact, he had 28 fights. And by 28 fights, you at least have some idea of what's happening. And they all went the full 20 rounds and everything. The guy didn't get KO'd early and all of that stuff, which is good. So my point anyway is this. Now, newspapers used to judge the fights back then too, and then, sometimes bias and all these crazy things went into the fights. But my point anyway is this. This is a legitimate fight. This is a legitimate win. And you know what? That's the only win he had that's legitimate. All the others are draws. He had 5 legitimate draws. 3 of those legitimate draws were against 1 opponent. So at the end of the day, he only fought 3 decent opponents in all those fights. Let's move on. So that's weak opposition, and it's a padded resume. Jimmy Wild. I told you he fought 104 fights, right? Let's look at the 104 fights. Can you see the same trend I'm talking about in this column? Look at this. Okay, this is early in his career, so we can give him an excuse there. Let's move on. Let's move up. 42 fights in. Look at the kind of opponent he's facing. Let's keep it going. 74 fights in. Keep it going. Okay, he fights a guy called Harry Brooks. He's a journeyman. He's got some experience behind him. But look, 89 fights in. 90 fights in. He fought Bill Kine. But other than that, what we got? See? So, looking at that, you see that if we were to look at when he first lost to the guys that he was fighting, he basically was fighting journeyman, right? Al Mansfield was a journeyman. He beat him, right? He beat him again. He rematched him. And then you have Joe Simons, and then you have Sid Smith. And then Tansy Lee's the first fight he ever fought with this kind of record. And Tansy Lee beats him to win the flyweight championship of the world. And by the way, Jimmy Wilde is considered the best flyweight ever in English boxing. The best. But the guy has nobody he really beat in his undefeated record. Okay, he had 4 legitimate wins against guys who were either journeymen or they were okay fighters, right? He has 7 no contests against decent fighters. He has 92 poor fights out of the 104 fights. So 104 fights, but only 4 legitimate wins. So you always put things in perspective when you talk about undefeated records in boxing. You have to always ask yourself the Roger Mayweather question: who they fought and who they beat. Carlos Monzon. Carlos Monzon lost 3 times, like I said before, but he had, after those 3 times, 80 undefeated fights. He wasn't defeated after that for the rest of his career. Okay? Let's just inspect this. So Alberto Massi beat him, right? He had some really good fights here. He fought an undefeated fighter in Celedonio Lima. Okay? And then he goes on to fight some pretty good fights. And then he comes and fights in his 26th fight this guy. 8, 27, and 4. The guy has had 8 wins in his 50 fights. The odds on him losing a fight are pretty high, huh? Why was he fighting this fighter? I don't know. But this is not a good fight. This guy was a good fight, even though he had less experience. It was very, very, very minimal. And he's a journeyman, right? This guy, Felipe Cambino. I'm just looking at records right now. I don't really know who Felipe Cambiero fought. He was a Brazilian fighter. I actually looked it up. He didn't fight nobody of worth. But the point anyway is that at the end of the day, his record still says that he's a journeyman. And at this point in time, in 28 fights over, he's a high caliber journeyman. You allow that to happen, right? This guy here fought to a draw, so you excuse that. But why Gregorio Gomez? Why this dude? Why? Unless it's a stay busy fight. He then fights an undefeated fighter again, the same guy he fought before, Caledonia Lima, right? He fights him again. That's the same dude right here. Alright? Again, he fights to a draw. So it's a good fight. He fights an undefeated fighter, Antonio Aguilar. That's a good fight. Carlos Alberto Salinas was a very good fighter. Okay? So these are all credit. But then why fight these fighters? I'm not going to go any more through the guy's career. But the point is that some of these fights, you can just see it on the face of this. These fights are just no-nos. I mean, this is a great fighter, okay? That was a great Argentinian fighter. This is a no-no. No-no. This is a no-no. I'm not even talking about the journeyman yet. You have 44 fights in. This is a no-no. No! You know, in our modern system, but with people who fight anybody, anytime, any place, anywhere, this was allowed to fly. So that's padded up accounts, right? Benny Briscoe, great fighter. Legendary fighter, right? So my point anyway is, when you look at it and put it in that perspective, and even in his championship fights, he became world champion here in his 81st fight. And that's great. Nino Benvenuti, great fight, undisputed world champion. Why do you go after that and fight Charlie Austin, Domingo Guerrero, and Roy Lee for stay busy fights? Why? Huh? And I can go on and on and on how he did this. He even had a commissioned fight with Jean-Claude Gaultier. Looks like a good record, but the guy wasn't worth, he wasn't worth flatulence. Tom Boggs after was just terrible. Benny Briscoe, absolutely. Roy Dale, who's that? And Journeyman, you know. So in the end, I'm just showing you examples to show you something. That when it comes to Carlos Monzon, he had 80 fights, yes, where he was undefeated. But of those 80 fights, really only 15 were worth the while. And of those 15, 11 of them were championship fights against some really good competition, mind you. But my point being that 11 of those fights, only 4 of the fights while he was not world champion, are worth noting. Okay? Then you have, so 15 out of 80 fights. It's much better than Jimmy Wild and Jimmy Barry, but still, come on now. 56 of those fights were poor fights or mismatches. Okay? Let's look at some other guys. We have Packy McFarland. And Packy McFarland follows the same sort of pattern of these old school fighters. Packy McFarland, he's fighting low-tier, inexperienced fighters. He's in his 23rd fight, he's still fighting debutants. 27th fight, still fighting debutants. 33rd fight, still fighting debutants. 40 fight, still fighting debutants. Alright, and then he starts to fight some decent fighters like Kid Goodman. Alright. Benny Yanger. Okay. He also fights, and he rematches some of them. Freddie Welch. Freddie Welch was a good fighter. He actually became a lightweight world champion. Okay. I'm not going to mention all the good fighters' names, but as you can see here, he drew with Freddie Welch, who was world champion, lightweight world champion. Right, so that's cool. Right. He also, let me just make the mention of some other names which were pretty good. Harlem Tommy Murphy, who he fought multiple times, and also he fought. This is just to make a joke here. He fought Eddie Murphy. No, not Eddie Murphy, the comedian, but I just thought it was funny. He also fought. Let's see here. And by the way, he's still fighting debutantes 99 fights into the game. That's ridiculous, but it is what it is. He also fought Lockport Jimmy Duffy, who beat. Lockport Jimmy Duffy, he beat at the end of the guy's career the legendary Benny Leonard. He beat Benny Leonard. Okay, it was at the end of his career, but nonetheless, he beat him, right? So he also beat Jack Breton, who was a very good fighter, and Mike Gibbons, who was a very good fighter. In fact, Mike Gibbons was one of the people I think that beat Harry Kreb at middleweight. So, and he also moved up in weight, by the way. So this is all very important to note. But at the end of the day, Packy McFarland had 104 fights where he was undefeated. But of those 104 fights, only 31 of them were legitimate fights, and he had 2 draws. So 71 of those 104 fights were mismatches. And you can clearly see that, right? Alright, now how I look at these things is I give percentages. For instance, the percentage of legitimate wins out of 72 fights for Jimmy Barry was 1.4%. The percentage with Jimmy Wild out of the 104 fights that were actually legitimate wins was 3.8%. With Carlos Monzon, out of 80 fights, he had 15 legitimate wins, so the percentage of legitimate wins out of the undefeated fights is 18.8%. With Packy McFarland, it was a little higher. Legitimate wins was 31, so out of 104 fights, his legitimate win percentage was 29.8%. Let's look at Sugar Ray Robinson very quickly. Sugar Ray Robinson, like I said, he went undefeated after losing to Jake LaMotta for 89 fights, which is really remarkable. And after he beat Jake LaMotta, he fought a very noteworthy, after he lost to Jake LaMotta, he fought to California Jackie Wilson, was a notable name of the day. He rematched Jake LaMotta, beat him, and then he fought a guy he should probably have never fought, but this is the way of the era, was Freddie Cabral, who, even though he's 38-3 there, he's just not a fighter. He fought nobody. He did nothing of worth. In fact, I'm going to just show you who Freddie Cabral is and his record, just for you guys to understand what I'm talking about. So this is Freddie Cabral here. And Freddie Cabral fought all these other guys you're seeing here. Guys with records, as you can see. You can just watch the records and see what their records look like. Okay. He was beaten by a guy 18-4-1, Balestrando Carubia. All of these guys fought either in the New York areas, as in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, because that's where he lived. He was a New Yorker. Massachusetts, right? So he basically fought in his local area, kind of like what Chris Algieri used to do. He was beaten by a guy called Joe Bennett with 12-4-1. Remember, this guy's in his 58th fight, right? Bunny Farrell with 26-16-3. These were all journeymen, right? That doesn't matter so much because back in the day there was a lot of journeymen, but you're not seeing. He beat Ozzie Harris, who was a bum himself. Sugar Ray Robinson beat him, but before that he had beat no one of note. There's a lot of journeymen he beat. You can see that. This is a very experienced journeyman. Journeyman. Johnny O'Keefe, Izzy Janazzo beat him. And Izzy Janazzo was a bum. Okay? Another bum. He actually fought this bum 3 times for reasons unknown to me. A guy with 10-4-4 beat him. 25-0, 95-0. All these guys beat him. 9-4-4. These are all journeymen. They beat him. Okay? He beat a journeyman who was losing a lot. It's kind of a little bit below even. This is 8 rounders. 6 rounders. 4 rounders. Okay? So this is the beginning of his career here. He finally fought a 10 rounder. He lost it. Finally beat a guy called Ernest Cat Robinson. And 3 times. My point anyway is he didn't fight any notable fighters. 1. 2, he was from Portugal anyway. He didn't fight any fighters with really decent records or anything like that. I think any fighter with a decent record basically blew him out the water. All of these guys are losers. This guy's a loser. This guy is 38-9-0. That's a high level journeyman that he fought in Massachusetts. But the question is who this guy beat. Let me just go even a little deeper with you guys. Who did Ernie Ford beat that made his record worth the while looking at, right? So he was beaten by Sammy Secrete. So he's fighting a lot of journeymen, as you can see here. A lot of journeymen, failures, losers, journeymen. All right? A lot of journeymen, right? Lots of journeymen. Lost to journeymen, right? I'm just showing you something so you can understand. Freddie Cabral, this is the guy we're talking about. He beat him, right? He knocked him out. Look, he's being beat. He beat by Freddie Cabral again. Look, journeyman. And I'm not saying there weren't a lot of journeymen of that day, but these are not even noteworthy journeymen. Like, these are guys in the local area. Get what I'm saying? So that when I talk about Freddie Cabral, who he fought, who he beat doesn't even come into the equation. Just give me a guy with a decent resume. Somebody who beat, strong enough competition. You can't find it with Freddie Cabral. Now, some people will say, oh, well, these guys began their fights. They just kind of jumped into the pool, and so they got beaten early. Yeah, well, you would see that on their boxing resume. You would see that he got beaten early. But the opposite happened. What happened early was that he had a pretty clean record. He was beating a lot of people, but that's because he was on the up and up. In the 6 rounders, and his 8 rounders, and 2 rounders, and 4 rounders. As soon as he reached 10 rounders, he was getting beaten by just about, people who were like no names, or people with relatively decent records. This guy's a journeyman. He beat him. Knocked him out, too. This guy has a little better resume. He beat him. This guy, okay? This guy is Earl Turner. This is the guy. He beat him. Journeyman, he beat them. Right? This is another journeyman. He's on another level to him. Apparently, he beat him. Right? Look at the guys. Look at the guys who he beat. All are journeymen. Different levels of journeymen, but they were journeymen. Right? You look at Sugar Ray Robinson's stuff, he has some journeymen in there, but they're actually higher caliber opposition. So let's go back to Sugar Ray Robinson here. So why did he fight this guy? I don't know. I didn't know how this guy got a fight with him, to be honest with you. Ralph Zanelli, good fighter. Right? Is he a journeyman? No, he's not really a journeyman. If he's journeyman, he's a high-tier journeyman. Okay? Henry Armstrong, not a journeyman, obviously. Izzy Janazzo. What's he doing fighting this guy? We just talked about it. He's a bum. This guy beat this guy. So I don't know why he fought this guy to start with, but it's just a different time, right? And they're fighting 10 rounders as well. Lou Woods, his record looks good, but he ain't fought nobody. Vic Delicurti didn't fight nobody. Sheik Wrangle didn't fight nobody. George Martin, oh, that's a good name. Billy Farrell didn't fight nobody. Tommy Bell, okay, he was a good name. All right. So my point anyway is that when you go through this guy's resume, Jose Basora was a good name. Jack LaMotta is a good name. You know, Sammy Angett's a good name. You know, Artie Levine was a good name, right? Georgie Abrams was a good name. Jimmy Doyle's a good name. California Jackie Wilson's a good name. Kid Gavilan's a good name. Young Gene Buffalo's a good name. Steve Benoit is a good name. See what I'm saying? Robert Villamain's a good name. Jose Basora was a good name. Bobo Olson's a good name. Bobby Dykes was a good name. See what I'm saying? Okay, then Randy Turpin, you gotta call him a good name. He wasn't really that good a name, but he became world middleweight champion, so you gotta give him it. You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, Sugar Ray Robinson, as much as he fought some good names, there's also a lot of fights in which shouldn't have fought them, right? So out of the 89 undefeated fights that he had, 28 of them were legitimate, and 2 of them were draws, legitimate draws, 1 legitimate no contest. 58 of the fights were poor fights. When we're talking about the percentage of fights that he had, which were legitimate wins, 31.5% of them were legitimate wins. So he's better than Packy McFarlane, Carlos Monzon, Jimmy Wild, and Jimmy Barrett. When you look at Willie Pep, Willie Pep had 74 fights in which he was undefeated. Of those 74 fights, I'm just going to go through it. You can look at the opponents of him if you want. But after being beaten by Sammy Anguett, he fought Bobby McIntyre, who was, he wasn't that great. He was a journeyman as well. But then he fought Sal Bartola. And I'm just going to show you the fights which really are worth the while thinking about. So you have Jackie Wilson, Sal Bartola. We go for a little while. He's in the 74th fight. Julie Kogan, you could probably add that. Willie Joyce definitely was a good fight. Manuel Ortiz was a good fight. Lulu Constantino, very experienced fighter. All right. You got Charlie Wright, who was the world champion. You won the world championship from him. Chalky Wright, sorry. Who else is a notable name here? Phil Terranova, that was a good name. McAllister gave him a good fight. Jackie Wilson. Jackie Graves. Lefty LaChance. Chuck Leslie. Patty DeMarco. Luther Burgess. Alright? So those are some of the guys that gave him good fights. So at the end of the day, when you're talking about Willie Pep, out of the 74 fights, he had 32 legitimate fights, 1 draw, and 41 poor fights or mismatches. So he had a 43.2% legitimate win percentage in his 74 fights. That ranks him above Sugar Ray Robinson. Then you have Julio Cesar Chavez. Julio Cesar Chavez, if you look at his career, again, he's kind of like all those other fighters. He's fighting a lot of debutantes very early in his career. In the 16th fight, he's still fighting debutantes or very low-tier fighters. So, like, this fight and this fight is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. All these fights here, from here to here, are unacceptable. You know what I mean? This fight is unacceptable. This guy, okay, he can hang. This is unacceptable. Unacceptable, unacceptable, unacceptable. 35 fights and you're still fighting guys who are debutantes. That's not acceptable. 37 fight, you're still fighting a debutant. 38 fight, you're fighting a debutant. 41st fight, you're still fighting a debutant. 42nd, still fighting debutants, right? He's fighting debutants, which are basically stay busy fights, right? So it's kind of like the old school kind of fighting. So the resume kind of is padded because of that. So he fights a guy 23-11-1, which is a journeyman. That sets him up for the world championship fight. He beats Mario Martinez, who is not a world champion per se. He's vying with him as a top contender. Why couldn't he be fighting fighters like this? That's what I didn't understand. He becomes the world champion and then he fights again another bum. Manuel Hernandez, no experience, no nothing. Shouldn't be fighting this level of competition. Ruben Castillo, not really the top level opposition. However, he does fight Roger Mayweather, Rocky Lockridge, Juan Laporte, Edwin Rosario, Rafael Limon, even though it wasn't a commissioned fight. That guy was a former world champion. Roger Mayweather, Sammy Fuentes, Mildred Taylor, Lonnie Smith, Angel Hernandez, Frankie Mitchell, Hector Camacho, Greg Hogan. All of these are good fights. Pernell Whitaker. And then he finally loses to Frankie Randall. But at the end of the day, Julio Cesar Chavez fights him 49, not as much as Sugar Ray Robinson, but 49 poor fights. But he has 40 really legitimate wins, with one legitimate draw, which is against Pernell Whitaker, which we can argue was a loss, but that's another story for another day. Point anyway is, out of the 90 fights, he has 40 legitimate wins. So his percentage of his 90 fights, which are legitimate wins, are 44.4%. That's greater than Willie Pep, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Carlos Monzon. Big stuff. Let's look at Ricardo Lopez. Ricardo Lopez is probably the guy with fought the weakest competition out of all the guys we're talking about. And the notable names that Ricardo Lopez faced actually are Zolani Petello, okay, Anucha Fortong, Will Grigsby was a former world champion, Rosendo Alvarez, who was a world champion, and he fought him as a world champion and took his world championship away from him. He fought also Alex Sanchez, who was a former world champion. Moncol Charouin was also a former world champion. Let's see here. Yamil Caraballo, I think he went on to become a world champion. Manny Melkor was a former world champion. Saman Sorja Turong, he became a long-reigning light flyweight champion. Okay. Pretty Boy Lucas was a pretty decent contender. He fought for championships a couple times. And then, of course, he faced Hideyuki Ohashi, who was a world champion at the time. So he fought some notable names, but not as strong notable names as, say, a Sugar Ray Robinson, or even a Julio Cesar Chavez, or even a Carlos Monzon, right? Willie Pep again, being a lower weight class, you kind of have something like that. But Ricardo Lopez, though, he also came from the newer school. Still, though, if you look early on in his career, he's not really fighting, as I said before, the level of competition he should have been fighting, right? Still a lot of debutantes and stuff. But still, at the end of the day, Ricardo Lopez, with 52 fights, he fought 33 legitimate fights. He had one legitimate draw, and that was, of course, against Alvarez. He had 18 subpar or poor fights, okay, mismatches, let's call it that. So he ends up with a percentage of 52 fights, which he was unbeaten in, of 63.5% being legitimate fights. But even though that percentage is pretty high, you got to note that he didn't really have the kind of level of legendary competition that Julio Cesar Chavez, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Carlos Monzon fought. His only probably biggest one was Alvarez, I think, legitimate competition. Because at the time, the guys just weren't prepared to fight him. Let's just put it that way. Then you have Rocky Marciano. Well, to be honest with you, the highlights of Rocky Marciano's career are Archie Moore, Ezra Charles, Jersey Joe Walcott, Joe Louis, and Rex Lane. Those are the highlights, okay? And I guess those guys are how many? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you really fight 5 really Hallstone opponents. And of those 5 Hallstone opponents, 4 of them are really all-time greats. They definitely are, okay, hands down. Now, again, JCC and Sugar Ray Robinson have actually fought better competition all around than Rocky Marciano. In fact, mostly through Rocky Marciano's career, he's fighting journeyman, right? Lee Savol's a high-tier journeyman. Freddie Bishore, he's a journeyman as well, okay? It's a low-tier journeyman, even though his record looks better. Will Applegate was just horrible. Art Henry's horrible. All right. But most of his diet was on Ted Laurie. He fought him a couple times, and he was just a journeyman. So at the end of the day, he was fighting mostly journeymen. But how he came up was through the new system. In other words, after 10, 11 fights, you're not supposed to be fighting guys with just a few fights. There's 1 or 2 of them where that happened. So at the end of the day, because Rocky Marciano came up under the new system where he dealt with level to level, even though he did fight a number of journeymen, he still has, in terms of poor fights and poor fight matchups, only 10. He has 39 legitimate wins out of his 49 fights, which gives him a percentage of legitimate wins to number of fights, undefeated, of 79.6. So that makes him the 2nd highest ranked guy in terms of the fights that he had, the quality of fights he had at least, consistent quality of fights he had. So it is what it is. With Floyd Mayweather Jr. now, with Floyd Mayweather Jr., he had 49 fights, of course, and I can pick out on my hand the guys who he shouldn't have fought. In his 9th fight, he fought a guy that won 1 fight, lost 13, and drew 1. Jesus Chavez. He shouldn't have fought this guy. I don't know why they picked him. So it is what it is. I guess they wanted him to look good or something. The other fight that he shouldn't have picked early in his career was Miguel Mello. Now, actually, this is an okay fight, actually, so I'm gonna let it go. Miguel Mello basically was 8-1. He lost 1 fight and he won 8, and basically he has 9 fights to Floyd's 15. So Floyd had a little bit more experience on him, but that's basically it. So it's debatable. I'm being hard on Floyd, so I picked this one. The other fights were when he became world champion. He beat Gennaro Hernandez. He had beaten Angel Manfredi. He had no business fighting Carlos Alberto Ramírez, even though it gave him some experience. And Justin Juca was another dud. And the last person on that listing is this guy here, Victoriano Sosa. So he had these high-tier journeymen that he actually fought. They had good records, but they really effectively beat nobody. And when you look at the competition they faced, no one was even the record that they faced, right? So that's basically it. So out of his whole career in fighting, he had 5 poor fights or mismatched fights, and he had 44 legit wins out of his 49 fights. That's a percentage of 89.7% of all his fights were legit wins. So he's number 1 on the table in terms of percentage-wise, his legit wins. Then comes Rocky Marciano. Then comes Ricardo Lopez. Either Ricardo Lopez, like I said, he kind of was, his competition wasn't as strong as all the other guys, like, you know, Julio Cesar Chavez and Willie Pep and Sugar Ray Robinson and Carlos Monzon. Then comes Willie Pep with 43.2% of all his fights being legitimate wins. Sugar Ray Robinson's next, 31.5% of all his fights are legitimate wins. Packy McFarland, 29.8% legitimate wins. Carlos Monzon, 18.8% of all his fights are legitimate wins. And then Jimmy Wild and Jimmy Barry. Why I bring it to your attention this is because I want you to see what the old school used to do and what the new school used to do. And you have to pay attention to that. Now, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter so much about the how undefeated you are for how long. What really matters is what kind of level of competitors you face. You know, the level of competition you face. And that's why I showed you these undefeated streaks. With Floyd, 44 legitimate opponents is the biggest amount of legitimate opponents that were faced in Floyd Mayweather's undefeated run. Julio Cesar Chavez had 40. He's the second highest legitimate wins against legitimate opponents in his 90-fight run. He's the second highest. Then the next highest after that is Rocky Marciano. And then the next highest after that is actually Willie Pep. After that, Packy McFarlane comes into play. I'm sorry, no, it's not Willie Pep. It's Ricardo Lopez, but you know, he can't have weaker competition than Willie Pep. And then after that was Willie Pep. Then after that was Packy McFarlane, and then after that was Sugar Ray Robinson, and then after that is Carlos Monzon, Jimmy Wild, and Jimmy Barry. So when we talk about undefeated runs, Floyd Mayweather Jr. really has the most substance in all of them. And no one can question the legendary status of some of the fighters he has faced. And Floyd has fought a number of legendary fighters. Some people will say not as legendary as, say, some fighters that Rocky Marciano faced. I can see some of that, but not really. I just say Manny Pacquiao, and that basically dwarfs almost every fighter there. I can say Oscar De La Hoya, and Oscar De La Hoya pretty much dwarfs any fighter that Rocky Marciano has faced. And I'm talking about the all-time greats like Ezzard Charles, and the all-time greats like Jersey Joe Walcott and Joe Louis. You know, Joe Louis, I mean, he has the longest championship record, only matched with Floyd Mayweather and Ricardo Lopez. And Floyd and Joe Louis have the longest and also the most amount of championship wins, being undefeated, consecutive championship wins, right? So it's just what it is. But at the end of the day, what I'm saying to you is this, that, you know, Floyd's got Oscar, he's got Pacquiao, he's got Marquez, he's got Mosley, he's got Cotto. And every one of those guys I just mentioned, which is 5 of them, every one of those guys I just mentioned have done legendary things, right? And then on top of that, he also has some other legendary fighters, such as Alvarez, who's probably going to become an extremely legendary fighter. Okay, Hatton was dominant in his division at light heavyweight. Light welterweight. Sorry, my bad. And then you have Gennaro Hernandez, who's a legend in himself. You got Jose Luis Castillo, who's another legend in himself. You got Diego Corrales, who's so I mean, at the end of the day, when you're talking about Floyd Mayweather's resume, it's crazy. And to think that this guy was undefeated after facing that kind of opposition. Rocky Marciano, you remember, he only faced like 5 important names. Floyd tripled that. Okay, he almost quadruples it. Maybe he has quadrupled it. So, you know, that's just ridiculous, just thinking about that. And then when you put into perspective that, okay, Floyd didn't face as many really tremendously legendary fighters as Sugar Ray Robinson, but at the same time, Sugar Ray Robinson then beat all those tremendously great fighters. And when we look at this 89-fight winning streak, basically he has almost all of them in there. And still, at the same time, Floyd still trumps that with less fights, you know. So I mean, and then he still stayed undefeated after all of that happened. That's not ordinary. That doesn't happen every day. Okay, he's got a better resume than Rocky Marciano in terms of the number of competent fights he had. Rocky Marciano fought mostly, you know, journeymen most of his career. At the end of his career, he really fought some really decent fights. Floyd was fighting high caliber fights and legendary fights from the beginning of his career, because he became a world champion very early in his career. A luxury Sugar Ray Robinson didn't have, I admit. Julio Cesar Chavez had it. Roberto Duran had it. You know, Willie Pep had it. We're talking in terms of time. We're not talking in terms of fights. You know, Carlos Monzon didn't have that, right? So, I mean, it's all in perspective. When you put these things into perspective, this is what you get. So I thought I would share that with you guys. You guys have a great one.